Hello and welcome to today's economics podcast, which today I wanted to cover the Netflix series Narcos. If you're not familiar with the series, the first series was about the Colombian drug trade in the 80s, starring Pablo Escobar, who being the main character, one of the world's biggest drug dealers in the 1980s. And the newest series covers Mexican drug gangs starting out in the 1980s, and it's blighted Mexico society for the last 30 years. You could bordering on a civil war at points. But in the latest series, in the Mexico one, when watching it, I was realising that there was an awful lot of economics that could be linked in and that it covers, especially with the current concepts we're covering in terms of market structure, oligopolies, collusion, interdependence, which we're going to do soon. So firstly, if we go back to the product that in the Mexican series of Narcos they're selling. So they were selling marijuana. So the demand for it, if we think of a demand and supply diagram, is inelastic. For the people that use it, there are very few good substitutes. It's a necessity, a bit of an addiction. So the supply of the product is inelastic. This will be key later on when we get into why you form a cartel. It was also largely a homogeneous good. So you might have got different strands of the drug from different areas, slightly different strengths maybe, but essentially it was homogeneous. Wherever you bought the good, it was meant to be the same. Again, we'll come back to that in a minute. So that had a feature of perfect competition. In terms of suppliers, this again is a bit mixed. So the suppliers, you would have many different suppliers on the ground, but most of these small suppliers would be working for a bigger boss, El Patron, in the series. So the suppliers would be broken down into localities. So all across Mexico, when we looked at regulation and what is as an anti-competitive practice, Mexico was geographically split into, say, 8-10 areas, where in each of these areas, each different drug lord would control the area, they would control the supply on the ground. They had some implicit collusion, so that the drug barons didn't sit in a room at this point and say, we're not going to compete with each other. But it was an unwritten rule, which is implicit collusion, tacit collusion, that if you were one of the drug dealers, one of the barons in one area, you wouldn't go and supply and deal in the other areas. And they were quite happy to sell drugs in their areas and make money. In terms of barriers to entry, the barriers to entry were that the equipment used to make the drugs, you needed land to farm it, then you needed to process it, so that's quite high capital costs. The supply chain, so the logistics of getting it from, in this case, getting it from Mexico up to America, the supply chains were taken up by these different drug barons. So if you wanted to enter the market, you would have to get one of these supply lines, which was going to be very difficult. And it being drug dealers, the force and violence that they would use against you. So a huge barrier to entry, a deterrent from you entering, is that if you enter our market, we might shoot you. Pretty big barrier to entry. But when they had this setup, they're all interdependent. So they're interdependent, meaning the actions of one relies on the actions of another. So if one of them decided to go into another territory, then they would start a war, essentially. So there would be a drug war, there would be people shot, and a battle. So they were relying on So they were relying on not interfering in each other's territory. They were happy to make their money, but that only worked if each of them didn't enter. Now, in the series, I think it's in the second episode, one of the characters, Gallardo, has the idea of going round all of these cartels geographically across Mexico and seeing if they wanted to collude. So if they were willing to collude, and a more formal collusion, i.e. a cartel, which is where you would have heard of drug cartels, is that they would have formalised this collusion into a monopoly. So if they all agreed to join forces, they could have a homogeneous product. And in the series, he sells this as a more quality product, so you can raise the price. And then they could restrict the supply and raise the price. So that would be, remember, it's an inelastic demand, relatively inelastic supply. If you shift the supply curve left by restricting the price, you could bump up the price loads. So essentially, by having the formal agreement, going from collusion to a cartel, a formal agreement to restrict supply, they would become a monopoly. They could act as a monopoly as long as they all acted together. With this monopoly, they would obviously gain abnormal profit. And in the series, you'll see, and it's happened in other series as well, like Breaking Bad, that with this abnormal profit, they can buy better equipment. You can buy more farming equipment, more processing equipment to make the drug quicker. This means they can increase their supply, which we'll get to in a minute, being a bit problematic. So they could spend it on research and development to make the product and service better. But in reality, and as we see in the series, there is lots of inefficiency. So the drug barons won't be able to resist buying. One of the main characters buys hotels, buys banks, throwing lavish parties. All of this is inefficiency. That abnormal profit could be being used for the research and development and investment in the business. The key thing to this cartel is the collusion between each group in each geographical area of Mexico. So it's only that when they agree to keep the supply as it is, keep the supply restricted, this keeps the price high. But if any individual gang, if any individual area of the cartel decided to increase supply on the sly, so we've agreed to make X units, we're supplying X units per month, this keeps the price high. But if one of those cartels or one of those cartel members decides to just supply a little bit more so they can gain a little bit more money, obviously what that does is push supply to the right, unbeknownst to the other members, and then price begins to fall. So there is always an incentive to cheat. Obviously, in the series, it's a drug cartel, so if they find out, the punishments for breaking this in other cartels might be you get kicked out of the group. Obviously, in a drug cartel, the punishments for breaking the deal and being found out might well be that you get shot. So there's quite severe punishments in this example. The other incentive is maybe to dilute the product in this instance. So if you are selling drugs, if they dilute the product or measure it differently so it's of benefit to the producer, they're able to keep more of their product back, cut it with something else, and then sell it again. So there's two incentives for each individual member of the cartel to cheat. So if they cheat on supply or the product being lower quality by cutting it with something else, then it benefits that individual member for a short period of time, but it will ultimately lead to the collapse of the cartel. Another thing is that all the members have to agree and get on. So in the series, there are two barons from different areas that have a past and don't like each other, and they fall out. But that's the same with other cartels, and members and managing directors and chief executives have to get on and agree with each other. The other really stark concept that the series portrays is that of monopsony and labour markets. So in one episode, they are busing people from a village or town over to the plantation where they are picking the crop, where they're picking the drugs. And this is a good example of monopsony and labour markets. So all of the farmers are low skilled, but in plentiful supply. There are loads of farmers. They can't get any work elsewhere in this village. Unemployment is high. So therefore, the drug barons come along, are a monopsony employer. They're the only way these people can get work. So in that instance, they have to accept whatever wage rate is offered. And the wage rate, obviously, is very low. So you've got lines and lines of Mexican farm workers who want a job. There are no other jobs in town, so they have to accept the wage rate of the one employer in town, the monopsony, which in this case is the drug cartel. Obviously, working conditions are long and poor. They're obviously not unionised, again, because if you get found out, if you break the Baron's rules, then you will be shot. So this was very important, this cartel collusion, as it was one of the questions on paper 3 in last year's exam paper. So in last year's exam paper, the paper 3 was discussing OPEC, which is the most well-known cartel in the world. So OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So as it says, the product is oil, and if you think back to our comparison with drugs, it's a homogeneous product, it's inelastic. Yes, it fits those things. You've got a few large firms, or in this case countries dominating supply. Yes, the likes of Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Venezuela, all of these countries are in OPEC. They get together and they decide on output, and their aim is to restrict output and raise price. So again, all the same things apply. They have to agree. There's an incentive to cheat for each individual members. So in terms of last year's paper 3, it was opened itself up to lots of micro and macro discussion. Remember, on the paper 3, especially for the 25-mark question, you'll get slightly longer than you would for a normal 25-mark question. You'll also get slightly more data. And what you're looking to do, again, is 3 perfect paragraphs with your definition, diagram explained, point clearly and well analysed, lots and lots of data use, including numerical data. To get level 5 paragraphs on paper 3, you have to use numerical data, i.e. back it up with some of the numbers they give, and you must evaluate in depth. So you're looking for 3 of those paragraphs in paper 3, and it has to be a mix of micro and macro. So the key to getting this question right is choosing the correct diagrams. So if in last year's paper, if it's discussing OPEC and a cartel, you could have gone with a demand and supply diagram where you discuss the fact they're both inelastic. You could have looked at the negative externalities caused by oil in production or consumption, really, and again discuss that. So they're 2 diagrams, externality and demand and supply, with a bit of context, with a bit of explanation, can still get you very high levels. But you would also want to use maybe the monopoly profit diagram. So each of the countries in the cartel would be making abnormal profit. This could be spent, again, on research and development or inefficiency and dividends to shareholders. In terms of macro, you are always going to do in all of your paper 2 25-mark questions, and almost certainly in your paper 3 when you're discussing the macro point, you are going to have to do an aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram. And remember, for aggregate demand and supply, oil would affect short-run aggregate supply. If they're restricting the output of oil, raising price, this would shift SRAS to the left, cost push inflation, and that's how you would deal with that. So that was a quick overview of how Narcos, the Netflix series, can link to economics and lots of different economics concepts. Also linking our cartels to paper 3. It's a very good series as well. So, but with an awful lot of economics links. So if you do have some spare time, maybe over Christmas, catch up on the Narcos series and think of economics when you are watching it.